Okay, so we are live. So welcome everyone to this KubeCon special. This is a boundary deep dive. Thank you very much for joining us. We have three very special guests today, so I'll introduce them one by one. So we'll start with Pete Pacent. So Pete, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell the community what it is you do.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks, Rob, and thanks everybody for coming out. My name is Pete Pacent. I'm the Boundary Product Manager. Have been with HashiCorp, I guess, 8 months now, and have basically been responsible for leading product management for the Boundary project. Looking forward to speaking with everybody today. I'm on the West Coast, so it's for both Jeff Malnick and I, a little early our time, but what better spot to start the morning with?
Yes, we definitely appreciate you getting up early to join the community there. And apologies for mispronouncing your surname. I guess it's the African in me.
Not a problem. Happens all the time.
Right, moving on to Jeff Malnick. Welcome, and if you can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, Jeff Malnick, engineering manager for the Boundary team. Also calling in from the very early morning hours on the west coast of California.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And finally, but not least, is Jeff Mitchell. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Sure. So I'm Jeff Mitchell. I'm the engineering lead on the Boundary project. Been with HashiCorp for about 5 years, and it's a little less early for me because I'm on the East Coast. It's actually a totally manageable 9 a.m.
I appreciate you all joining. Okay, before we get into it, I just want to say, if you have any questions or comments or anything like that, we do love to hear from you, and we'd love for you to interact with us in the chat. If you do, just please be mindful of our code of conduct in this virtual space. So just the general highlights are: be welcoming and inclusive, be considerate, be respectful, and be professional. And I'm sure we'll all have great interactions with each other. You can also review our code of conduct at hashicorp.com/community-guidelines. And with that, let's get started with this. So I'm probably going to start off with Pete. So let's talk a bit about Boundary. So this is KubeCon. There are probably some people here that maybe don't know what Boundary is or the problems that it's there to solve. So let's probably start from a high level 101 basics. So can you kind of give us a high level overview of Boundary, please, Pete?
Sure. So Boundary is I guess, recently released open source project that's available through HashiCorp. It's really focused on enabling identity-based access workflows for dynamic infrastructure. I guess as a whole, HashiCorp builds infrastructure automation tools for the various workflows in the application delivery lifecycle. And one of the workflows that we heard about was that humans ultimately, whether they're developers, DevOps engineers, or what have you, need a secure way to access that infrastructure. So with Boundary, we're really trying to provide that in a way where those access controls are based on the identity of the human in question rather than any kind of legacy IP-based controls. And then in doing so, we set up that access for dynamic infrastructure rather than kind of legacy-minded static infrastructure.
Amazing, thank you. So I think you've done quite a good job of, from a high level, kind of explaining what Boundary is. But I think maybe if we move to Jeff Malnick, can you kind of talk about some of the more specific use cases for something like Boundary? Like, why would someone consider using such an open source project? What kind of problems can they tackle within their organization?
Yeah, Boundary aims to solve the issue of gaining access to services across network boundaries. So if you're trying to access a container running on Kubernetes, for example, Boundary is one way that you could access that container. It allows you to consolidate the identity for accessing services into one product. As most people are aware, if you've ever run kube on AWS, for example, you have to interact with a few different identity systems. And you've got security controls in Kubernetes itself, you've got IAM controls, you've got the the bastion host potentially that's blocking the API for Kube itself. So there's a lot of different services and a lot of different identity systems that come into play when accessing those systems. And Boundary is aims to simplify that system by allowing you to consolidate everything into one product.
So essentially it becomes sort of like a single point of entry. Is that sort of fair to say?
Exactly, yeah.
Amazing. Now, one of the things that's come up since the announcement of Boundary is obviously we have another product called HashiCorp Vault. For anyone that was at KubeCon yesterday, we did a deep dive session on Vault as well. If you missed it, I believe the recording is available on YouTube, so we will link that in the chat. But one of the questions that comes up quite a lot is Boundary there to replace Vault, or what is the difference between Boundary and Vault? So I'm going to give this one to Jeff Mitchell, seeing as you were, I think, principal on Vault for a number of years. Can you explain what the difference is between Boundary and Vault for the people, please?
Sure. So they're actually very complementary. You know, Vault is really focused on security-based workflows around, I'll say more around data than connectivity. So things like gaining access to credentials that are either generated by Vault or that are stored by Vault, things like encryption, tokenization, all of these are kind of security workflows that Vault enables. But you know, where you can kind of see this come together is if you are connecting to a machine through Boundary, Boundary is gaining access at a network level, but it's not actually, you know, you still need credentials. And, you know, where we're going to be going with Boundary is the ability to go to Vault and say, please give me credentials that I can inject without having to expose those credentials to the user. And that's sort of coming on our roadmap. But at the current point in time, like, you know, you can say, okay, I want to SSH to a machine, but, you know, Boundary will gate whether or not I'm actually allowed to make that network connection that gets me access to that network. But I still have to have, you know, a key or a certificate or some other thing used at the SSH protocol level to actually log on. So they're very complementary in that way. You know, Vault can be the thing that is sort of the arbiter of the actual credentials for gaining access to the system, whereas Boundary is the thing that's allowing you to cross those network boundaries. And so together, they really provide a lot of defense in depth, which is great. We really like that. You know, when you're kind of in a zero trust security world, don't trust any one system, trust multiple systems together, each kind of watching each other's back.
Amazing, thank you. And with that, we have a question from the community, which I think it may have been answered in the chat, but I'll just ask it here just for anyone that's not kept an eye on that. So the question was, is Boundary based on Spiffy and Spire? I think maybe Jeff is probably someone that can give a quick answer to that. Jeff Malnick, that is.
Oh.
Jeff Mitchell could take it too, it's fine.
Yeah, classic
the Jeffs.
Look,
Jeff.
Any Jeff M on the call, just take your pick.
Yeah, just part of working with the Boundary team.
So the short answer is no. It's not based on Spiffy or Spire. There could be an integration for that in the not too distant future. It's not currently on our roadmap though.
Yeah, and to add to that, if you think about what I was just saying about Vault, you know, Spiffy and Spire are mostly about attestation. They're about you know, making sure that like you know, I can validate that you are who you say you are. So that's really essentially an authorization mechanism, and you know, authentication, which is part of the certificate that is, you know, holding those attestations. And so, you know, if you think about it, really I would put that more in the domain of like when I was talking about the difference between Boundary and Vault, I would put that more in the domain of like the Vault side, where, you know, if you could generate Spiffy, you know, certificates with those attestations, then, you know, you could imagine that at some point in the future, if we had such an integration that, you know, you could take in a Spiffy client certificate and you could, you know, validate it and use that as an authorization mechanism. But in and of itself, Boundary is really about the network access gateway. And so, you know, Spiffy and Spire would simply be an integration point as opposed to something that it's based on.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So with that, let's move on a little bit. So I think from a high level, we have an understanding of what Boundary is and the kind of problems it's solving. So if we maybe start to peel back the layers a little bit, let's talk about how it works under the hood. So in terms of, I think Jeff Malnick mentioned about being able to connect to sort of different endpoints. not having to go via different bastions or different kind of entry points. We're simplifying it with a single unified entry point for all of our infrastructure. How do we kind of define what that infrastructure is? What is the kind of the main terminology you use for that infrastructure, and how does Boundary kind of view that? I'll probably give this one to Pete to start with, that is.
Sure. So I guess in terms of how to define the assets under management within Boundary, there's a couple of ways to do so. In terms of how we organize those resources, we have permission boundaries within Boundary that kind of are analogous to those used within Vault, where we basically have identity organizational buckets at the scope level within Boundary. Those act as permission boundaries. Not to conflate or just ambiguate the term boundary here. Within those scopes, you can define a set of resources that identities with permissions to those scopes have access to. In terms of how to ingest those into the system, there's a couple of different avenues to do so programmatically. One of those is through Terraform, whereby if developer or DevOps engineers has their infrastructure landscape already defined in Terraform for how to provision that, they can basically seamlessly ingest that into Boundary using Boundary's Terraform provider. Beyond that, at 0.1, we also have a concept of static hosts, basically whereby you define an IP address and port to connect to that host or service that you need to access to do your job. That ingestion can be done through our UI, through various programmatic interfaces outside of Terraform, whether it's REST API, SDK, or through the CLI.
Amazing. So just to kind of clarify, so in terms of creating these kind of host catalogs dynamically, the only way to do that at the moment is if you're declaring your infrastructure with Terraform, and you can just kind of use Terraform's internal mechanism to sort of dynamically populate your catalog. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's a great, I guess, clarification there. So at 0.1, that's correct. The way to build dynamic references to targets or systems whose IP addresses may change, the best way to do that at 0.1 is through Terraform. In the future, we'll also have this capability that we call dynamic catalogs or dynamic host sets, whereby you can build dynamic references to the infrastructure that you want to access for a particular platform that infrastructure is hosted on. So based off of attributes of that resource, you can imagine like an AWS catalog, whereby you define references to hosts based off of the resource group or subscription or other attributes of that host or service. Similarly for Kubernetes, defining access to either the API or Kubernetes nodes based off of attributes of that end target. In terms of our future roadmap, we'll basically hope to have dynamic catalogs over the course of the next year, and basically have a roadmap for the different plugins that we'll support for these dynamic catalogs and dynamic host sets.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So we have our infrastructure kind of declared within Boundary, but we need some way to control who can access what. So essentially what we're talking about here is identity and access management, and how Boundary is tackling that. So to anyone that isn't aware, I actually wrote a blog article which tries to break down how the identity and access management layer is handled within Boundary. We'll put a link in the chat there. But that article is mainly based off a lot of the learnings I had from conversations with Jeff Mitchell, who's one of the key brains behind this. So Jeff, in a few sentences, are you able to, well, as long as it takes to be fair, are you able to give us kind of a high level kind of overview on how Boundary approaches identity and access management, how it deals with authorization, how it deals with the authentication piece? What are the different components and how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, that is a very very broad question, but I'll try to tackle it. So we have everything in Boundary is controlled by grants. It's fully zero trust. So you start out with no privileges, and then depending on how the system is configured, you are given grants. And this actually applies also to even sort of acting in an anonymous fashion. So, the ability to log in is because someone has given grants to the anonymous user on an authentication method. And so that way you can actually do things like disable an authentication method temporarily if you want to do some maintenance or reconfiguring, things like that. So from the ground up, you need authorization grants. And as a result, what we've done is we've made it very flexible. And so these grants are kind of separated by IAM domain, so in scopes. So you have roles that live in different scopes that give grants within that scope. And they can apply to users, they can apply to groups. And, I guess going back for a moment, one of the things we want to do right now, we have kind of an internal sort of catalog or sort of internal set of users, which are defined by passwords that you set within Boundary. We are actively working on OIDC support. So by I think 0.2, then you'll be able to connect it to an IDP and use information from that IDP to dynamically assign membership to groups and pull users into the system. Once you've done that, you can then tie those users or groups into the roles that you create, and the roles essentially map between those users and groups and the sets of grants you want to apply. It's very flexible. You can have users and groups be in multiple roles at the same time. And there are other things that we'll be adding kind of further in the future to allow kind of even more granularity as you go. But those grants themselves are quite flexible. They sort of are a trio of ID, resource ID, resource type, and action. There are capabilities to specify kind of broader sets of resource types with wildcards, or to restrict certain actions to particular like users based on like templating in their user IDs. So we've tried to really address kind of all the different use cases that we see about how you would want to use the system and make sure that that's addressable within the grant system. But each action then corresponds to things like your ability to read a resource or write a resource, but also your ability to do things like connect to a target, authorize a session, your ability to authenticate. So you have very fine-grained controls over basically the actions that users can take within the system and how they get mapped into that. And we think that, like every other permission system out there, you have to wrap your head around it a little bit, but it's true RBAC. And we hope that, once you sort of, we have actually a couple of pages that I can link to in, or somebody can link to in the chat in YouTube. But basically, we have some pages sort of walk through in detail, like what the different allowed formats are, and a big chart that sort of describes, okay, if you want to do X, here are some of the permission statements that you can use, and provide direct examples to do so. So there are a lot of resources out there to help you out.
You mentioned authentication methods, which to anyone that has used Vault will probably be familiar with that construct there. So at the moment, we have, what are we calling it? We're calling it password or user pass?
Password.
Password. We're calling it password at the moment. So it's a simple username and password. You also mentioned that OpenID Connect is sort of on the roadmap. Some of the use cases around kind of that kind of feature being worked on, are we basically talking about the ability for people to take their existing identity providers and basically extend that to Boundary? Is that kind of the thinking behind this, or is there a different workflow that you have in mind for that, Jeff?
No, that's very much it. We want to allow you to take your existing authentication provider. I mean, if you think about it from a bootstrapping perspective, like you need some way to say, okay, there is a user that can do that initial setup and bring in your IDP configuration. And so that's one reason that we started with password-based, is we need to have an ability to generate essentially an initial admin login. But once you do that, then we want to allow you to bring in the structure that you already have from other IDPs. And you mentioned a correlation to Vault, where a lot of like what Vault can do with its various auth methods or things like, let's say LDAP, you're saying, okay, here's the configuration to talk to LDAP, and then I want to like pull in group information based on membership within LDAP, right? We want to reuse the structure that you have. So that's the case here too. With OIDC, the way that we're sort of working on and building it is that we want to allow you to use the assertions that are provided by the IDP within the JOT and use that in a flexible way to assign group membership without you having to sort of like recreate all of the structure within Boundary. So, I think that's hopefully that answers the question. But yes, that's very much on our mind.
Amazing, thank you. Moving attention to Jeff Malnick now. So we're talking about all of these different components within Boundary. Now, what are the ways that someone can interact with Boundary or configure Boundary? We mentioned Terraform, but what are some of the other ways that you can do that? And is there any sort of difference in functionality between the different ways of talking to Boundary?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways you can talk to Boundary and configure it. 3 actually right now. So you can configure Boundary through our admin console. And that is a nice GUI that we provide for interacting with the controller and just the general data plane, and the ability to actually configure things like resources such as users, groups, roles, add a target, add hosts and host sets, and that sort of thing. That same admin console obviously gives you access to viewing live sessions and seeing who's connecting to what. The second way is with the command line. And obviously the GUI is just a nice graphical way of exposing things that you would otherwise do on the command line. The command line is advantageous if you want to script things, if you want to bootstrap stuff, that sort of thing. And the third way, which I think is the best way personally, is using Terraform. We created a Terraform provider that's 100% compliant with our API. So everything you can do on the command line, you can also do in the Terraform provider. Those two in particular are kept in lockstep with one another. So right now it's the best way to do things because there's the ability to dynamically configure stuff. You can use Terraform to export one resource out of your AWS module, for example, and pump that into a Boundary module. It gives you the ability to grab like instances, EC2 instances, for example, that you might want to otherwise turn to targets inside of Boundary. We actually have a great example of this on our reference architecture. We'll put the link into chat here in a minute about how you can do that interaction between a couple of different modules to configure Boundary in a dynamic way. Yeah, those are the 3 most popular ways to handle interaction with it.
Amazing, thank you.
And as Jeff Malnick said, Boundary is 100% API driven, right? So nothing in those clients is special or magic. You can write your own client if you so desire to have specific sets of functionality or macros or whatever you might want to do, and you'll have the same experience that you would get through any of the official clients.
Do we have some kind of API documentation for anyone that did want to go down that road there?
We do. We'll post a link in YouTube, but it's fully documented.
Brilliant, thank you. So I had a question, but I believe it's a question from the community, so I'm going to prioritize them first. And the question is, why should we use Boundary? So I feel like a lot of what we've talked about is trying to answer that question, but I'll give this one to Pete. Why should someone use Boundary?
How do we want to talk about that in terms of the use cases or just kind of the overall value proposition?
If I were to guess, I think we've kind of talked about the use cases a little bit here. So I think maybe we should be talking about the overall value proposition. What
Sure.
kind of business value can an organization extract from Boundary?
Sure. So I think if we back up at just kind of a high level, you need a secure way to make sure that humans can access their infrastructure. Usually that model requires imposing multiple different controls in kind of that workflow, whether it's adding a user to a VPN, giving them access to some SSH bastion host or jump host that straddles a public and private network, and then configuring IP-based controls at the firewall level in terms of what they have access to. It's a pretty complex landscape to do so. And I guess those controls also follow a paradigm where they're based off of the network location of the client in question. And with Boundary, what we're really trying to do is make sure, kind of shift that paradigm so that the controls to infrastructure are based on the identity in question. And in doing so, we make sure that enables a just-in-time access model, so that those connections created through Boundary are secured at multiple different levels, whether that's just in time in terms of the actual network connection created between a client and the end user, or down the road, like integrating with something like Vault for providing dynamic credentials that are time bound for the purpose of the session. And then I guess the third, outside of that identity-based access and the just-in-time access model, is that we're enabled to do so for dynamic infrastructure, so that whereas in kind of a legacy model, you need to configure these IP-based controls for infrastructure that needs to scale, might be deployed in the continuous CI/CD model. With Boundary, what we're really trying to do is deliver a service that can enable access for dynamic infrastructure and is fine-tuned to kind of meet the needs of a modern world, whether those services run on something like Kubernetes or one of the major cloud providers.
So if I can add
and
on,
I guess one last thing is just kind of a centralized way to manage that access across all of the different platforms that you might be deployed to. But Jeff, feel free to hop in there.
Sure. One thing I wanted to sort of add to that is that notion of ephemerality. So one of the things that, one of the issues that you get with sort of traditional access methods are that your firewall, right, usually that is configured well ahead of time. And so when you're dealing with infrastructure and you're dealing with granting access to infrastructure, it becomes kind of this onerous process to sort of keep changing it and modifying it. In all seriousness, we have customers that have full teams that do nothing but manage firewall rules. They have more than a million rules in their firewalls, and so they have teams of people that do just that. And so, I want to point out, we'll add a link. One of our principal product engineers, Andy Minosky, wrote a blog post called Shadow and Dust, talking about sort of the end game of that ephemeral architecture that we sort of envision with Boundary. And the idea there is that you could set up, let's say that you add some Terraform or you add some other kind of mechanism that you then, so you set up a machine. That machine then, essentially is spun up. You tell Boundary about this machine. You give grants to it. This is all API driven, so this can all be done, in the blink of an eye. Someone gets access through Boundary, so it's this like gated control to this machine. Gets access through Boundary to this machine, does some call or some action on it, and then that whole thing is torn down. And the idea being that it's very hard for adversaries to break a box if that box's lifetime is something small. And you can sort of think lambdas, but lambdas generally aren't hosting connections that you can go in on. So think about taking that concept and applying it more to like real kind of infrastructure. So the idea there being that if you can have that ephemerality, the closer you can get to sort of like that just-in-time access, not even just necessarily literal like, okay, I want to make a connection now, so I'm authorized right now, but even getting to the point where like there's literally no connection to make until right now, then that's, it really can enhance that security structure. And so I think part of the power of us sort of building everything API first is that you can sort of imagine worlds like that, where you can do this because you can just toggle a couple of different APIs to get all this set up within, a half a second, make a call, and then be done with it and tear it down a half a second later.
Yeah, I think the ephemeral approach it definitely adds a lot of power to reducing your attack surface in general. So I'm a big fan of that approach there. A lot of this conversation came from the question, why should we use Boundary? And I just wanted to point out that Jeff Malnick actually wrote a blog article, which we will link in the chat, which addresses the question of why we built Boundary in the first place. So that can help give some context as to why an organization may choose to use something like Boundary there. So we'll pop that in the chat. But moving on to the next question is, does Boundary support X509 smart cards? And I'm going to share this one between the Jeffs. So we've just heard from Jeff Mitchell. So let's hear from Jeff Malnick.
So right now, no, it does not. I think the ability to support authentication of a user via a CAC card or some other type of smart card system is on our roadmap. So be on the lookout for that in the not too distant future.
Jeff Mitchell, anything to add to that? I imagine.
No, I think, assuming that the question is around logging in, as we enable more kind of IDPs to act as the login mechanism, then that will be more kind of tenable. I mean, if you think someone asked about Okta as well, and that's the same thing, right? So we'll support Okta when we have OIDC, because you can then use Okta as your OIDC, IDP. So if you're using an IDP, especially one that supports OIDC as well, but then requires like a CAC card or some kind of smart card to authenticate, then that will just be something that you do with your IDP, and then it redirects back to us, and now you're authenticated to Boundary.
Amazing, thank you. Which actually leads us nicely into our next community question, which you've partially answered it, Jeff. The question is, when will Vault and Okta be integrated into the Boundary project? Are we talking weeks or months? I'll give this one to Pete.
Sure. So as Jeff kind of just noted, with Okta integration, that would rely on supporting OIDC, so that we can basically just follow that major theme of allowing our customers or users to bring their own identity provider for Boundary. We actually do have a public roadmap that we can include in the chat that shows the direction that we're heading, especially with regards to these two kind of primary features. So OIDC is something that will kind of support, or like I should say, prioritize highest out of all of our new features, and that'll land with our 0.2 release, which I would say is probably not weeks away, but in the course of I guess short months scale. And then on the Vault side, that's also something that's going to be prioritized shortly thereafter. With Vault, really the idea is that within Boundary, we want to kind of enable a single sign-on flow for users, so that they authenticate with their IDP of choice, and then based off of the targets or hosts that they're authorized to access, they can access those with credentials provided by some credential management solution that Boundary basically acts as a broker for. That might be Vault, that might be some other credential management solution. I do want to make sure to note that Boundary won't be coupled with Vault, where we require the use of Vault. But once we do enable that Vault integration, you could use Vault to broker the credentials required for that session. So to kind of go back to that analogy, a user authenticates with their IDP of choice. Let's say it's Okta in this case, through an OIDC authentication method. They're then authorized to access a set of hosts and services. And then when they go to actually make that connection, they can do so with a credential provided from Vault. That Vault integration piece is going to be something that we similarly prioritize highly over the course of the next few releases, and that'll be something we deliver on in the next few months.
I see that as kind of building the foundations of a building itself. If we get these building blocks in place, it just opens up so many other possibilities for architecture, if you like. So
yeah,
it makes sense.
Absolutely. And if you kind of, or I would just say, to kind of tie it back to that ephemeral access piece, you can imagine that being kind of like a layer, one of multiple layers of just-in-time access built into the product, whereby Vault, you basically give Boundary instructions to go and mint a dynamic credential, for a target or system that you're accessing, so that credential is time bound for the purposes of the connection or session that a user is creating.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Kind of on a similar theme, we're talking about integrating with identity providers here. So we have a question from the community: is pretty much when are we going to get LDAP integration? Is that even on the roadmap? I'll give this on to Pete as well.
Sure. So for different authentication protocols, I guess there's multiple different integration points within Boundary. One of them is the different authentication protocols that we'll support. Right now, OIDC is our highest priority one. In terms of things like LDAP or SAML, We don't have a specific timeline for those. We know that that's kind of in our vision to support. And I think the priority and timeline for the delivery of that is going to ultimately come from the needs of our users. So I guess the plug that I would put there is that if somebody's really interested in LDAP and that's a requirement to adopt Boundary, we'd want to hear about that, whether that's in the comments channel or through our Discuss forum or through our GitHub repo. Those are all great ways to provide feedback to the project, and that'll kind of guide how we make decisions about the priority of these items.
One of the other things, just one of the other reasons why we are targeting OIDC first is that there are actually several, there are various pieces of software out there that act as OIDC bridges. And so they essentially can speak to different sort of authentication backends, and then they front it with something that can speak OIDC. And so by standardizing on OIDC first, you can use a bridge such as DEX to actually connect to a very wide array of other authentication mechanisms, and then just simply point Boundary at that, at let's say DEX, and have it complete the OIDC flow that way. And so that's going to be one way that that this can be achieved, even using OIDC. It is another piece of software. It's not native, but, going after OIDC sort of opens up that possibility. And so rather than say, oh, LDAP specifically, and someone else wants, this specifically or that specifically, then it sort of just creates a broader set of possibilities there. The other thing I'll mention just on that topic is Vault gained access or gained the ability a bit ago to allow you to, if you authenticate to Vault, to pull an OIDC token out of Vault's identity system. And I believe, and I'm not making any promises on the roadmap, but I believe there are some investigations underway that would allow Vault to complete the OIDC redirect flow, so that if you're already a Vault user, you're already set up using something like LDAP on Vault, that you could simply use Vault as the OIDC provider for Boundary. So I know that there's some kind of experimental code that's being tested to do that. I don't know where or when that might appear. But DEX is certainly something that exists right now, and if you're a Vault user, Vault might be something that can do that in the future.
Brilliant, thank you. And in terms of some of these, some of them are roadmap items, some of them are just things that we're starting to think about. How can the community kind of stay up to date as to kind of what we're doing and what's coming out and what we're currently working on? Is there like some kind of mailing list, or can they hang out somewhere on Discuss or GitHub? What is kind of the place to go?
I'm happy to field that one. So we do post things to GitHub as well as our community. We also have a public roadmap in our documentation that kind of gives updates on things as we release. And then outside of that, obviously have a change log within GitHub that shows the differences and updates for all of our new releases, as well as release notes for minor versions.
That's amazing. So kind of going back to something that Jeff Malnick said, we were talking about the different ways that you can interact with Boundary. So he mentioned that we had the CLI, we also had a Terraform provider, we also had a UI as well that you can interact with. So one of the questions that comes up a lot when I speak to people in the community is about Boundary Connect and whether you can do something like that in the UI. So I kind of wanted to split this question up a little bit. So I wanted, if Jeff Mitchell can give like a high-level overview of exactly what Boundary Connect is and what it achieves. And then we'll go to Jeff Malnick to talk about whether this is possible in a UI at the moment.
Can I suggest we reverse those, actually?
Go for it.
So, sorry, I completely missed the beginning of that question, Rob. My internet just cut out a little bit. Could you repeat it for me one more time?
No worries. So what we were talking about is Boundary Connect. So we wanted to get sort of a high-level overview on what Boundary Connect is, how it works, and the second part of the question, which I think now Jeff Mitchell is probably going to answer this, is it available in the UI?
Yeah, so Boundary Connect is available on the command line today. At some point in the not too distant future, we're going to have the ability to access that via a desktop client. that's a new feature that's coming down the road here. And it's, so, I want to differentiate between the admin console and the desktop client here, because those are two separate features of Boundary. The admin console is a way of interacting with directly with the Boundary servers to configure resources, essentially. Whereas the desktop client will be a GUI client, kind of like your Slack client on Mac, for example, similar in nature, where you have a graphical interface that's 100% committed to helping you connect to targets in an easy way. And so that's going to be mostly for end users of Boundary, whereas the admin console today is for administrators of Boundary. I may have answered Jeff's question, the question for Jeff too, on accident there. Sorry about that.
I'll dive a little bit more into that, if that's okay. So one of the challenges with building something like this in the web browser is that we want Boundary to be able to proxy to essentially anything. So, a lot of people might think, an SSH window in the web browser, I've seen that done. And sure, you can do that. That generally requires you to, have some kind of box that you can sort of have in the middle that actually makes a connection and sort of sends it back to the browser. But that's, it's doable. Right now, because we focus sort of on a genericized TCP workflow, so that we can handle things like database connections and like SSH and RDP and so on, then that is a much more tricky kind of scenario, because number one, you can't always easily display those things in the browser. And number two, in many cases, we actually need to sort of manage connection parameters that browsers do not give you the ability to manage. So I think what will likely happen is that over time, we'll add the ability to make certain kinds of connections or certain kinds of calls within the browser. And there are various techniques for doing this. And so we'd probably look at it like on a protocol by protocol basis. As we get to a point where we are doing protocol decoding so that we can do things like credential injection, that protocol decoding then gives us that a possibility to, to be able to kind of stream information to a browser as well and sort of make that a reality. So, it's something we're keenly interested in, but there are a lot of technical challenges. And, there are various projects that have done things like this, and we've sort of looked at how they've achieved it. And there are a lot of different approaches. And so I think we're just going to need to see what might make sense for Boundary over time. One other thing I want to say about Boundary Connect itself, though, is that, and I know that this is something that's been a point of confusion for people at Rob, for when Rob is talking to people, is that we have Boundary Connect is a command, and that Boundary Connect command will, authenticate a session. It'll say like, okay, you're authorized to connect to this endpoint. So it authenticates this session, and it provides kind of a listening socket and port, so you can then use your client and connect locally. We also provide a number of subcommands. So these are things like Boundary Connect RDP, Boundary Connect HTTP, Boundary Connect SSH. And those subcommands are really just, they're essentially wrapping a couple of useful things up for you. So within the Boundary Connect command, there is a flag called exec. So you can say, I actually want to not just open up a listening port and socket, but I want to actually like exec a command. And then you can give that command, you can pass in like flags you want to give to that command. So when you run something like Boundary Connect SSH, what we're really doing is we're essentially specifying that exec command for you. We're specifying a number of kind of known flags to just make it really easy to not have you have to figure out those command lines yourself. So just something to clarify, because I know that Rob has told me that this is something that confuses people. All the Boundary Connect kind of sub commands are just things where we're trying to kind of provide useful execution defaults, and that's really designed to be kind of a library that we can build up over time. Whereas the actual kind of connectivity is sort of what's being kicked off by just the raw Boundary Connect. And so we can support right now anything that can run over TCP can actually be supported. We may just not have these sort of like helper things to exec other clients for you. And you are also certainly not locked into using those particular clients.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I think it should hopefully make a lot more sense to people exactly how this works. But if you do have questions, do reach out to us and we'll be happy to talk in more detail about that. Okay, so we're into the last 15 minutes. So as soon as we're at KubeCon, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about probably, from my perspective, the number one asked question since Boundary was announced is, can we run Boundary on Kubernetes? If I was to have £1 for every single time someone asks me that, I probably would be a millionaire by now. So yeah, I'm going to give this one to Pete. Can we do that? Can we run Boundary on Kubernetes?
So actually, well, so right now you can do so. We have a Docker Hub image available so that you can deploy Boundary on Kubernetes in a container. We do kind of have a roadmap though for future support that we'd like to have for that. I know Jeff Malnick has actually done a lot of work in this area, so I would say that he's probably excited to answer this one.
Yeah, so the roadmap for Kube, for Boundary in particular, today on our reference architecture, we have an example of how to actually set up Boundary inside of Docker. There's a couple of caveats that we lay out inside of that project. We'll make sure to link that here in the chat in a minute. The goal for Kubernetes is really to enable people to both run Boundary on Kube and also to access Kube services or workloads running on Kubernetes itself. So obviously there's a couple of different phases that we want to enable here in getting that out to folks. So the first is obviously, let's run Boundary in a container. So we have a Docker Hub image, as Pete pointed out. We'll also link that in the chat here in a sec. And so that enables you to, that image actually comes with a built-in configuration, but you can, volume bind a configuration into the container as well to override that. So you can run a worker or a controller, set that up in a Kubernetes deployment, get that launched on Kube, and have an actual Boundary deployment running on top of Kubernetes. So the second piece that we want to follow on with that is enabling operationalizing Boundary on top of Kube. So we're gonna, on our roadmap, we've got a plan to get a Helm chart out there that will enable people to easily operate Boundary on top of Kubernetes installation, lifecycle management, that sort of thing. Very similar to what we did with Vault there. Now, following on to that, we want to do some supported integrations. So a lot of people really enjoy using the Vault sidecar that we developed in the Vault K8s project. So we want to do something similar for Boundary. And in doing that, we want to enable a Kubernetes auth method for Boundary. We want to do Kubernetes-based targets, and we also want to, to enable all of this, we'll probably have something similar to the Vault K8s project that we'll probably call Boundary K8s. So there's a lot of follow-on work, obviously, that we need to do there. There's a whole roadmap dedicated to Kubernetes itself. And, down the line, after we get those first three core areas out to the community, we'd also like to talk about doing an operator at some point. Take that Helm chart, take it to the next level, make something that's really, handles lifecycle management really well on top of Kubernetes, handles specific failover situations, that sort of thing. So those are things to be on the lookout for. Yeah, we're really excited about the developments there.
That's amazing. I'm sure there's loads of folks out there are going to be quite excited for that development to come into fruition. In terms of running a containerized Boundary instance, especially with things like dev modes, are there any kind of gotchas that people should be aware of? I don't know who I'm throwing this one out to because I feel like we've all kind of spoken about this.
I'll
just heard from Malnick, so we'll give it to Jeff Mitchell.
I'll answer it. So running Boundary in a container, generally there aren't, I don't think there are any gotchas. Like a lot of other services, you have to make sure that you map the appropriate ports into it. The only thing that I can think of is, in dev mode by default, because we require a database. Currently, we work with Postgres. By default, we try to spin up a Docker Postgres container for you because, we want to make that dev experience seamless, and then we destroy it when dev mode goes away. This is not required. Docker in Docker is achievable but difficult. So this is not required. So if you spin up a container yourself, you can simply pass in an appropriate flag. I forget if it can be an environment variable or not, and if not, we can make it one. But you can certainly pass in a flag on dev mode startup that says, here's the database URL to use. And dev mode, for what it's worth, dev mode is essentially we created a number of resources that are very predictable. But this is something that, if you want to just try it out in kind of a Kubernetes-based workflow, you don't want to deal with, you're like, okay, part of this is I'm going to stand up a fresh database and I just want it to act like it does in production. Then what you would do is you could simply point at a fresh database, run the boundary database init command. If you want, you can actually have the output of that, which generates a bunch of initial resources with random identifiers. You can have the output of that come out in JSON, and you can sort of slice and dice it at will. What dev mode really does is it essentially creates those same resources, but it also it uses internal encryption instead of using external encryption, so an external KMS system. So it uses internal encryption, and it also generates a predictable suffix for those identifiers, so that you can sort of, as you use dev mode, you just know that every time that you start up, oh, here's my auth method ID, here's my initial target ID, etc. So it's an easier way to get started, and it doesn't require a config file. But yes, the only real gotcha is that we by default will start a container, but if you point us at a different Postgres URL, then we skip that.
So essentially, if you don't point to a different database, you have a Docker and Docker situation, pretty much.
Correct.
Right. Okay, that's good to know. And in terms of the, so obviously, by the sounds of this, the architecture of Boundary is that Boundary itself is stateless, and all of the data of that is stored in the database, which obviously can be a stateful workload. What kind of data is Boundary storing in that database, and sort of how sensitive is that data?
I can take this, unless someone else wants to. So all of its state. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, uptime is important. Uptime is when you're using this as a gateway to your resources, it's very important that it's up as much as possible. And so rather than have kind of a coordination, there's sort of two reasons we settled on an RDBMS. One is that we can, RDBMSs have transactions and are ACID compliant, and do a lot of things that allow you to use it as the arbiter of state. And that means that if you're used to running an RDBMS, which a lot of users and a lot of companies are, and in many cases with things like Docker, it's very trivial, that you have a very solid, like rock solid piece of software that's doing all this kind of state management for you. And so it means that it basically means that, like, as controllers, as boundary controllers come and go, if you have to upgrade them or whatever, or if you want to bring up more workers or scale the number of workers you have that are doing the proxying based on your traffic, that this is really kind of very transparently handled and with sort of minimal kind of state going back and forth. So we don't require a consensus protocol internally. So the other piece of that is that we know that, the specific types of service we want to offer here really benefit strongly from actual semantics of data integrity and relational data. So because Boundary essentially is a large series of resources that have life cycles and that are managed and that are referenced in various ways, standardizing on RDBMS allowed us to essentially make sure that those relationships are maintained appropriately. So we have checks in the domain layer that make sure that we're consistent, that we don't have things that are sort of sitting around that are forgotten about, data that shouldn't get should have gotten dropped that shouldn't be, or data that's sort of linked, linking a resource to another in an inappropriate fashion. So we have those checks at the service or kind of the code layer as well, but it's also in the domain layer, which is really nice. So really all of our state is stored there, and it also provides one other thing I'll mention there is like you can point something like I think it's called PowerDB, or you can point kind of business intelligence tools at Boundary's database and actually use
Power
it.
BI,
Kind of,
is that the one?
Power BI, that's it.
Yeah.
So you can use something like Power BI, or I also forget the other one that's very common because I don't use these very much. Tableau, that's it. I should know that. My brother-in-law uses Tableau like all day, every day. So I keep hearing it, and then I always forget it when I need to remember it. But you can use something like Power BI or Tableau, and when we're looking at things like our session information that we store when sessions are created and connections are created and so on, that actually is done in a model that lends itself extremely well to business intelligence tools. And so you can do a lot of analysis through that. So that's a really I think that that's, it kind of shows the power of sort of standardizing on that. It really fits our model really well and allows us to have really good kind of stability, but it also means that you can do really good analysis. So as far as the information that's being stored in there, the other thing I'll mention is we require a set of keys, KMSs, or really we require a KMS. It can be multiple ones. We have a couple different like root keys for different purposes. And then we are encrypting things in the database. And so just to be very clear, the information that goes into the database, anything that's sensitive, talking passwords, you're talking op logs, you're talking like things that, credentials, anything along those lines is encrypted. And that root of trust goes up to the KMS that you give to Boundary and Boundary's controller on startup. And so that can be Vault. That can be Vault's transit plugin. It can be AWS KMS. It can be Google Cloud CKMS, Azure Key Vault. It can be any of the clouds. Basically anything that that Vault supports for auto unseal. If you're used to using that, is supported by Boundary, including Vault itself. So we also very much limit. So if you're a worker as opposed to a controller, the controller is actually handling the API, kind of doing the API calls. The worker is the thing doing the proxying. The worker does not need access to the database. It cannot access the database directly. It has one KMS key that it shares with the controller, but the KMS keys that are actually managing encryption within the database, within the storage in the database, do not have to be exposed to the worker. And so we have a really good kind of separation of concerns in terms of the security design.
That's amazing. Thank you for clearing that up. It's a really good explanation there. Okay, so we are just about out of time. So before we go, I just want to remind the community of a few things. So this is obviously a KubeCon special. We are running deep dives for the rest of the week. So pretty much every day you'll have different topics being discussed as deep dive sessions via HashiCorp. So be sure to join those. And thank you very much for joining. I just want to give a couple of shout outs to some people in the background. So this wouldn't be possible without the work of Alexandra, who's doing a lot of coordinating behind the scenes. So big thank you to you, Alexandra. And I also want to shout out the rest of the Boundary team as well. A lot of what we've seen in the public eye has been the Jeffs and Pete, but there are a whole lot of folks that are putting a lot of work into making Boundary what it is today and continuing to improve the product and listen to the community. So big thank you, especially to, we've had Jim and we've had Mike as well helping us out today. So thank you to you. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you very much, Rob.